Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Uma Mishra-Newberry. I am the Volunteer Executive Director of Women's March Global. Today, we are featuring another webinar in our partnership with StandWithKashmir. Since 13th of September 2019, Women's March Global and StandWithKashmir have held webinars in an effort to share knowledge and educate people on the complexity and history of the conflict. The webinar series is a space for anyone who wants to learn about the ongoing situation in Kashmir, as well as the history leading up to present-day Kashmir. In the past few months, we have discussed topics around why Kashmir is the most dangerous place on earth, how to survive in the world's most militarized zone, what daily life under occupation looks like, sexual warfare and what women in resistance in Kashmir looks like, and most recently, the place of Kashmir in Bollywood. Today's webinar, Detainees Across Borders, Kashmir, Palestine, and Guantanamo, is part of StandWithKashmir's Release Kashmiri Prisoners campaign. Kashmiris have been held in jails in Jammu and Kashmir and all over India before and in the aftermath of the events of the 5th of August, 2019, to include minors, women, those who are ill, and the elderly, in addition to those who have been languishing in jails for years for expressing their dissent to India's occupation. An estimated 4,000 to 13,000 people have been detained since the 5th of August. StandWithKashmir calls for the immediate release of all Kashmiri prisoners. As part of this conversation, we wanted to hold a global dialogue around the situation of detainees across borders. So it is with deep gratitude that I now introduce our panelists for today's webinar. Habeel Iqbal is a lawyer based in Kashmir who has worked on cases relating to human rights violations in Kashmir generally and on detainees in particular. Currently, he is practicing law in Kashmir and also working with the organization Association of Parents of Disappeared Persons. Habeel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Osama was previously a steering member of the National Students for Justice in Palestine and is now an organizer with the Palestinian youth movement. He is currently serving as a general coordinator of the Atlanta chapter in the state of Georgia. Osama, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And Dr. Asim Qureshi is the research director of the advocacy group CAGE, who assists individuals detained and harmed under the global war on terror. He is the author of A Virtue of Disobedience and the forthcoming editor of I Refuse to Condemn, Resisting Racism in Times of National Security. Asim, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Great to be.
I will ask each of the panelists to speak for around 15 minutes on their respective topics. After that, we will open the forum up for questions for our audience, both here and those who are following us on YouTube. So please post your questions as the discussion continues to progress, and we will do our best to get to your questions at the end of the webinar. So Habeel, I would like to start with you first. If you could talk to us about what your work is in your focus area.
Yeah, first of all, I would like to thank StandWithKashmir and Women's Global March for giving me this wonderful opportunity. As you said, my name is Habeel Iqbal. I'm based in Kashmir. I practice law and I mainly deal with cases of human rights violations. That includes cases relating to detainees, cases relating to enforced disappearances and other human rights violations. And currently, I'm also working with an organization that is Association of Parents of Disappeared Persons. It is a collective of victims of the members whose kids and kins have been forcibly disappeared at the hands of state. So I have been working with them also and focusing on the law practice also. Am I audible? Yeah. So coming to the role of the detentions in maintaining the occupation. Well, I can say that since 1947, the Indian state has systematically used the detentions and arbitrary arrests, that includes also the preventive detentions, to politically suppress the people of the Jammu and Kashmir. From the last 3 decades, Kashmir has been one of the most militarized zones of the world, and we have seen that how the state uses laws to enforce its writ on the people of Jammu and Kashmir. Uh, since 1947, there have been many political prisoners who have been taken to jails, whose personal liberty has been snatched by the Indian state. And if we talk about like 2008, 2010, 2016, and we saw unprecedented arrests, detentions, and other methods that include torture as well. Especially, I would like to talk about post August 5th, 2019, when India deoperationalized the Article 370 in Jammu and Kashmir. And since then, even according to the Home Ministry sources of Indian government, around 7,500 people were arrested in Jammu and Kashmir, and around 450 were detained under a law that's known as Public Safety Act. I'll come on to that later also. And that included minors also. Even the state also recognized that some of the minors were also detained under administrative detention. These arrests have been broadly under acts such as Public Safety Act, Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, and as I said, we'll come to that again. So, about the role these detentions play in maintaining this occupation, I can safely say that we are living under a permanent state of exception here, a state of emergency in which the Indian state uses extraordinary laws to maintain sovereignty, and it wants us to believe that it's for the good of the people that we are invoking such stringent and harsh laws. So it's the laws which these authorities use. It's these laws which legitimize their excesses. In a way, we can say that we have legitimated excesses here. Under the garb and under the color of these legislations, the draconian measures are imposed on us. It is these extraordinary measures which help the Indian state control and dominate the people of Jammu and Kashmir. I can say that those who hesitate to wallow in the pure discourse of colonialism, they hide behind the fig leaf of the law. So for them, law is the mask which they use to perpetuate their excesses. So it's the mask which really muddies the water, which obfuscates, which confuses, and we can say it kind of nauseates the perpetrator. He kind of gets an excuse. So it gives him that sense that what he is doing is right because it is legal. So that's what most of the people in India and also outside believe, that what is happening in Kashmir is not wrong because it is legal. And why it's legal? Because it has the legal backing of laws, because we have seen how the laws operate here. So that is one part, that what role do these detentions play in maintaining the occupation. And now if I come to the part that of a political prisoner, who is a political prisoner, and what are the demographics of these political prisoners who have been taken under arrest here since, I can say, 1947. Uh, so, as most of us may be knowing, political prisoner is a one whose liberty has been deprived because of his political opinions. He holds an ideology, and that's for which he is either persecuted, prosecuted, convicted, whose liberty can be deprived in many forms. It can be an arrest, it can be a detention, and it can be torture also. We have seen how these, they work more or less in tandem with each other. So that's one part of that, who is a political prisoner. And we have to see here what's the role of the legal structure, because once we say that somebody has been prosecuted for his political opinions, that means we are impugning that there is a political motivation. Although the political motivation is a political concept, but it is the legal structure which makes it possible. It is the legal structure which perpetuates it. So that's how the legal and the political go hand to hand. One supports the other, and that's how they go. So we have political prisoners here. I would like to name a few. Uh, we have Dr. Qasim Faktu, who has been in jail for the last 27 years. And he has been convicted under a law which was known as Terrorist and Disruptives Act. This act, which was in vogue in Jammu and Kashmir, it was a very harsh law, because it could also you could also be convicted for a confession given to a police officer. It made it admissible that even if you are giving any confession under any duress, it will be used against you. So he was convicted under this act. He is in jail for the last 27 years. But owing to the hue and cry, this act has been repealed now. But he continues to be languishing in jail for the last 27 years. And although this act has been repealed now, we are seeing that Yasin Malik, who is a resistance leader of Jammu and Kashmir, who is facing a trial under this act now. And can you believe he is facing a trial after 3 decades now? So they are the Indian state is saying that you had killed some Indian Air Force personnel, but that was long 3 decades back, and he was here in the public gaze. So we can safely say that he is one more political prisoner who is languishing under jail presently. And then we can talk about Mia Abdul Qayyum. He is one of the topmost lawyers of Jammu and Kashmir, and he is the president of the High Court Bar Association. He was fighting the case of victims of the human rights violations in court. And moreover, at the time of his arrest, he was arguing the case about the revocation, about the assault on the Article 370, its legality in the court of law. So he was detained under Public Safety Act on 4th of August 19, that's last year. And we have seen his dossier. The dossier says that you are an ideologue of secessionist ideology. You hold secessionist ideology. So here we have a state which on record goes to say that we have incarcerated you in administrative detention for your that these are all political prisoners. And then we have the case of Masrat Alam. He's another resistance leader. He has been under arrest. He has been intermittently under arrest for 23 years since 1991. And he has been under administrative detention. That is, he's not facing a trial. And the courts usually don't uphold this law, don't uphold the administrative detention order. But what the state does is it reimposes the Public Safety Act. So we have these revolving door detentions also. And then we have somebody like the tallest and the most respected leader of Jammu and Kashmir, Syed Shah Geelani. He is under an indefinite detention. He has been incarcerated in his home. He is in his 90s. And since 2010, he has been incarcerated in his home, and he's not allowed to move outside. So they call it house arrest. And you won't find any formal orders for that. Uh, Now I'll quickly come on to the demographics part. What are the demographics of these political prisoners? Uh, in my opinion, it will be safe to say that cutting across all sections of the population, you will find the political prisoners here. And in this context, the Indian state has arrested people from all walks of life, be that political leaders, political activists, human rights defenders, journalists, you name anybody, any business leaders have also been arrested. So this is, yeah. And sorry, I'm running out of time, I know that. So the legal apparatus we can talk about, the legal apparatus in which these prisoners, so we have laws like Public Safety Act, we have laws like Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, we have laws like Armed Forces Special Powers Act. All these laws give impunity to the state in dealing with the prisoners. It's under these laws that arrests have been made. So now we will quickly come on to these recent cases of journalists who have been hounded using Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which is an act which is so broadly couched, and you can be booked for anything which they feel can cause disaffection against the government. And in my sense, it is like tyranny in the name of national security. And then these laws cannot hold on the principle of legality. That's the laws should be clear. That's one. And recently the human rights rapporteurs, they have also called on the state of Jammu and Kashmir to release political prisoners like Mia Abdul Qayyum. And now for example, if we talk about the remedies, what are the remedies here? Remedies are basically the courts. You invoke the extraordinary jurisdiction of the courts and you file a writ of habeas corpus. But again, it takes months together. And then as soon as you are out, you can be booked under a different Public Safety Act. And the impact is huge. It's on the families, it's on the individuals, it's on the community. The impact they want to create is to have a reign of terror in our minds, to rule our minds and to have a deafening silence here. So that's it.
Thank you so very much, Habeel. I know that for myself and so many of us, that this understanding of how laws are used against Kashmiris is something that many people don't understand. And you said in your presentation, law is the mask that the Indian government uses to manage their excess. It gives the perpetrator the sense that what he is doing is right because it is legal. And that is the view that so many people outside of this situation have and continue to have. And the unpacking of those complexities cannot happen in 15 minutes. So I appreciate that you had to condense so much of that. But thank you for your discussion on this. We will definitely, there's some questions that have come in for you, and we will definitely ask those after we've had the presentations from Asim and Osama as well. So thank you. Osama, I would like to turn to you now to really shed some light on it. I know that you have a presentation to share, so I will turn it over to you.
Is my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, is it full screen?
It is not full screened. Perfect.
Okay, so yeah, my name is Osama. I'm really glad to be here and to talk about the prisoner struggle in many different areas of the world. And I'm looking forward to this discussion as we not only discuss detainee struggle in different areas of the world, but to link their struggles intellectually and practically. So thank you, Habeel, also for your analysis of the political prisoner conditions and draconian affairs in Kashmir. I will get started. I first want to begin with a key point here that the political prisoner struggle in Palestine constitutes one of the most important elements of our struggle. The approach I take is one that attempts to emphasize the prisoner, at least in the Palestinian context, as an agent of the national struggle. against the occupation. So it takes a, maybe more historical approach that I hope may frame a little bit of our discussion in terms of how we support detainees in a new light. So our objectives will be to cover this idea of what a political prisoner is within Palestine, the inception and development of the prisoner struggle, and a lot of emphasis on the Palestinian prisoners movement. So one thing to note really is that there isn't really a universal definition of what a political prisoner is. There are varied definitions. Many institutions, many human rights institutions have kind of different parameters of what defines a political prisoner. But I would say, basically speaking, I would say that they basically constitute a category deemed by the state to be undesirables, people that are deemed to be a threat to state hegemony. And usually refer to prisoners who have particularly waged struggle against the state to achieve certain political objectives. In contrast to that, there's a prisoner of conscience, where Amnesty International, for example, defines a prisoner of conscience to be somebody who has been jailed or had their freedom restricted because of their beliefs. And most of the time, they are individuals who have not carried out acts of sabotage or acts of violence. And the people who have advocated for violence cannot be deemed prisoners of conscience. So the difference here is that you will have Amnesty International, for instance, and some other liberal institutions that will actually call for the release of prisoners of conscience, but are very careful to go beyond that and advocate for the release of political prisoners if they deem them to be too radical or too revolutionary. And so with this designation, we have to recognize the inherent limitations of a liberal institution, a neoliberal institution, to truly defend our national struggles. As Habeel was also discussing, administrative detention, a term that covers the arrest and detention of individuals without charge or trial, usually for security. In the Palestinian context, administrative detention was actually introduced via British law to subdue Palestinians during their revolts. So in this sense, you have, and it was adopted by Zionist policy. So you have this sort of like colonial and imperial legacy, very inherent, very blatant when we talk about the Israeli occupation of Palestine. And since 1967, we've had about over 50,000 administrative detention orders since. And I am moving a little fast here for the sake of time, primarily to get into the Palestinian prisoners movement. But in 1967, or since 1967, we have had over 800,000 Palestinians incarcerated. Following the Six-Day War and the occupation of the Palestinian lands, West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, that figure 800,000 refers specifically to the West Bank and Gaza alone, so excluding East Jerusalem. On top of this, the Israeli legal system refuses to acknowledge or recognize Palestinian resistance as prisoners of war and consider them outside the regulations of war, describing them as terrorists. So as where some prisoner rights may apply to prisoners of war, they apply much less so, or there's a lot fewer rights that can be applied to people that are deemed terrorists. With that said, the objectives of Israeli imprisonment of a population mass imprisonment is to isolate and is to pacify. So it's to isolate Palestinian revolutionaries and dissidents from the rest of their society, and through that process to pacify their nationalist aspirations. So since 1967, that's really been the sort of character of the Israeli policy of mass imprisonment. And from this, you've had a response to the Israeli attempts. And that response is really manifested in the Palestinian prisoners movement. So as the imperial and colonial prison is meant to disconnect the prisoners, disconnect its inmates by isolating them. In contrast, the inmates of the prison seek to communicate, seek to reconnect themselves to each other and to their society. And that's exactly what the sort of precursor to the prisoner movement did in Palestine, is that we began to see organizing begin early in late 60s, And some of the early actions they would take is simply utilize new tactics of communication. So for example, writing on cigarette papers, messages, and passing them on to each other discreetly in defiance of the prison guard, or writing in a capsule or capsule, writing again a letter and kind of rolling it up, putting it in the capsule and passing it discreetly in order to again communicate and transfer knowledge in defiance of the occupier, and even going to the length of swallowing the capsule and then discharging it through their stool when they go to another area of the prison. So that's the level at which they went to communicate and to build community. Democratic decision-making really characterized the kind of early process of organization we see in the early days of the Palestinian prisoners movement, and I'll elaborate on that. So the objective here also, or like the sub-objective, is the attempt, we're trying to get into the first intifada and to describe the experiences of the prisoners during the first intifada. So we're jumping, but to give some political backdrop of this period, I feel like this context is important. In 1982, the Palestinian Liberation Organization was expelled from Lebanon, and so by the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. What that exile did was cause a shift of local leadership within the occupied territories to rely more on mass-based structures and less on armed struggle. So they're seeing the defeat of the representative body that was carrying out armed struggle. So you see the shift in work against the occupation. So what this looked like was mass-based structures, popular committees, unions among every sector of the Palestinian people. The point here that I'm making by highlighting this backdrop and then getting into this sort of shift in the mass-based structures is to point out that the prisoner movement reflected the broad changes that was happening outside of the prison. So what I mean by that is, as you've had this shift away from armed struggle, you had more and more Palestinians be, and especially young Palestinian students, be detained by the Israeli occupation based on mere affiliation with a group conducting resistance, even nonviolent resistance against the occupation. So now we're having more and more younger students in the prisons. At the same time, so we're having a diversification of the demographic. We are having a decentralization of the sort of hierarchy and the rules within the prison organization. So in this sense, we see this kind of link between the university and the prison as incubators for the Palestinian movement, producing new leaders over time. So academia, and what I mean by that is the university was also a site in which Palestinians and Palestinian academics used academia as a way to resist against, and their right to education to resist against occupation. At this point, as we're leading up to the first Intifada, which was launched in 1987, we can say that the internal education programs, which is what the Palestinian prisoners movement was conducting, these programs were, you can say, schools of revolution. And what that means is, as a community, the Palestinian prisoners were organizing programs of education covering history, foreign languages, including Hebrew, political theory, and more inside the prisons. A production of magazines written in notebooks featuring poetry, literary criticisms, political analysis. So in a sense, the Israeli prison became a major site of political organization. That is instrumental to understanding why the prisoners movement was so easily able, or not rather easily able, was in the position that it was to influence the first Intifada and to influence what was going on in the Palestinian street. So the relationship of the prisoner movement to the street is summed up as this. The high level of organization and discipline that was produced in the prisoner movement served as a model for the popular committees going out on the outside, on the streets. And also the growth of the popular committees outside empowered the PPM, in that more and more through mass imprisonment of these young Palestinians, the Palestinian prisoner movement, and not just young Palestinians, all Palestinians, the Palestinian prisoner movement began to be reinforced. So to note, there was this empowering relationship between the outside and the inside of the formation of the committees on the outside with the Palestinian prisoners in the inside. And we also see that through this concept of sumud. And in the concept of sumud, meaning steadfastness in Arabic, to briefly describe it, it carries with it this meaning of enduring like the olive tree, right? Where the roots stretch deep into the land. So no matter what, resisting, enduring, staying on your land, despite the means institutionalized to remove you from the land. This characterized the mass structures that were happening on the streets, in the Palestinian villages, where people were sort of had a political orientation that poverty, for instance, was not due to it didn't exist in a vacuum. It was fomented, it was strengthened by the Israeli occupation. This concept of steadfastness and identifying the root problems of every socioeconomic problem you can have, from agriculture to prison to women to healthcare, women's rights to healthcare, is kind of the foundation of Sumud. So to describe Sumud in the prisoner context, just briefly, Sumud within the prisons was the philosophy of how they struggle. What that means is that Sumud, as this philosophy of steadfastness, was institutionalized by the prisoners' movement. The philosophy of confrontation behind the bars was one of the manuals that was actually produced by the prisoners with no author, no date of publication. People say that there is at least one copy of this manual in every Israeli prison set up for Palestinians, by Palestinians, where the book deals with the question of how the Palestinian activist, of what the Palestinian activists arrested by the Israeli colonial authorities should do when they're being interrogated, right? And the philosophy of confrontation embodies and sort of regenerates also the Palestinian experience, but they also drew upon the experiences of other revolutionaries living in the world. Also, because my screen is full screen, if you're giving me a warning that my time is running out, I can't tell. So if you could, 3 minutes, okay. And what the manual did was tell, the Palestinian who was newly in prison to remember the party, the political party, remember the neighborhood, remember your friends, remember your family. In the prison, the only weapon you have is the body. And it is your tool to disrupt the colonial authority and the colonial relations. What is the manifestation of Sumud? What is the manifestation of the body as the weapon? It is the hunger strike. And in the Palestinian context, Palestinians have carried out hunger strikes continuously throughout the period since 1967, demanding access to education, completing high school exams, university exams, proper medical care, and to solitary confinement, and so on. The hunger strike in Palestine carries enormous revolutionary potential in the sense that it actually causes Israel to become very anxious when this happens because of the possibility of it igniting popular rebellion. So in this way, we see how the prisons are able to inform, are able to get the outside to mobilize around the prisoner struggle. And due for the sake of time, I'm going to have to kind of move through this very quickly. But the Oslo Accords of 1993, there's a lot of background needed to understand Oslo, but I will reiterate that the Oslo Accords, the peace process, was really an instrument of Palestinian surrender. And in this case, we saw this sort of, neoliberal focus on this idea of state development. And through state development, we saw the dissolution of mass-based structures. The same ones that supported the prisoners, they were crumbling. And so now you have this shift from a framework of sumud, of steadfastness, of national liberation, to a sort of legal, liberal human rights framework. And what I mean by that is sort of the kind of maneuvering that we see Amnesty International did. And this is just to say that the struggle of the prisoner today is very dire. because of the dissolution of those mass-based structures. My last two slides here, I just want to mention the effect on families and public health in that mass imprisonment of Palestinian prisoners, they are typically, most often, the Palestinian prisoners tend to be working age men, husbands, fathers, sons, who function as primary providers for their families. So this has obvious implications in terms of public health, in terms of how is the family supposed to sustain itself? And then also the psychosocial trauma amongst Palestinian children who are detained by the Israeli Defense Forces and are kidnapped in the middle of the night at like 3 a.m., sometimes going as young as 6 years old. In sum, the Palestinian prisoner movement represents to the Palestinian national movement not simply a branch of injustice, not simply a statistic, not simply a component of one of the many crimes, one of the many gross violations of international law and human rights that Israel conducts on a daily basis, but they represent to the movement a movement of leaders in the movement, where you've had Palestinian leaders run and win positions in the Palestinian Legislative Council, where you've had prisoners mobilizing together, being able to supersede factionalization, where they orchestrate hunger strikes. All in all, what we have to remember is that when we talk about prisoners and we want to mobilize around the question of the prisoner everywhere they are in the world, is to remember their agency, remember them as leaders, remember that, at least in the Palestinian context, they're the compass of our struggle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Osama. I'm just going to, there we go. Thank you. And I know for everyone listening on YouTube and for those who are in our webinar, it's so difficult for all of our presenters to unpack this topic in 15 minutes. Osama, you brought up, I think something that really has struck a chord with people, given what is coming in on the chat, also in YouTube and also on Zoom, in that people would have never thought of prisons as incubators for leaders. And you brought up the fact that the political prisoner struggle in Palestine constitutes one of the most important elements of the struggle itself. You also referenced at the very beginning of your talk how we need to make the connection between what is happening in Kashmir to what is happening in Palestine, and to what Asim, you will talk about in Guantanamo as well. And I think, if for those of you who are listening, if you can think about what Habeel said and what Osama just presented as well, and as Asim is presenting, the connections of what is being represented here, the challenges and the complexities that prisoners in Kashmir versus Palestine versus Guantanamo are all facing. One of the questions that has been asked that I will definitely put to the panelists is what can be done from a global context to help this political prisoner situation globally that we see. So thank you so much, Osama, for that presentation. I know that many people found that very, very instructive and useful. Asim, I will turn to you to talk about the situation and your work, especially with Cage in Guantanamo.
Thank you. Bismillah, Assalamu alaikum, and good afternoon to you all. Thank you for taking the time to join us. It's always quite difficult to follow up after two very, very brilliant presentations, but I'll do my best to do justice to theirs. My thanks to StandWithKashmir, especially, and the Women's Global March for inviting me. I do appreciate being given the platform to be able to speak about some of our work. So I guess I really want to start by saying that the war on terror as a construct, it globalizes so much of what we see in various national contexts around the world. What was taking place in Palestine and Kashmir, and in varied contexts, we found kind of everywhere, all at once. So all nations bought into this narrative of an immediate need for national security legislation. They enacted that legislation, and they allowed for a system of pure hegemony, of national security hegemony, to prevail over the world. And so when Osama and Habeel were talking, whenever they were referencing anything, immediately my mind was going to different contexts, whether it was Guantanamo Bay, whether it was Abu Ghraib, whether it was pre-crime detention in the UK or CVE in America. You will find the echoes of all of these. And of course, with Palestine and Kashmir, much longer issues, they have a much longer history. And one of the things we have to recognize is that they're all learning from one another in these moments of repression. And I think Angela Davis, she does a great job of explaining this when she says that in order to understand the militarization of the police in Ferguson, Missouri, you need to understand the militarization of the police in Gaza. Like, these things are inextricably linked to one another. We can't think about one without thinking about the other. And so in that regard, you know, because I think especially that Habeel and Osama did such an amazing job talking about political detentions themselves, what I want to do is actually pick up on the last aspect of Osama's talk, which is really about what happens to all of those hidden places within these detentions, the ones that we don't necessarily privilege in the same way because they're almost seen as collateral damage. And I'm talking about here like the families and especially children. Going back a number of years, this is back to 2006, I remember interviewing the daughter of Saifullah Paracha, who's one of the oldest people in Guantanamo, who's in his 70s now. I was interviewing her and talking to her about her experiences, and she's describing me to this moment of being on the internet and reading all these things about she's mentioned specifically what's happening in Palestine. She's a young Pakistani girl sitting in Karachi, but looking about what's happening to the Palestinian people. And I think at that time, Lebanon had just been attacked by Israel. And she said that when I go into school the next day, my friends are all talking about the latest shawls, the latest designs. And I'm looking at them saying to them, what is wrong with you? There is real stuff going on in the world. You know, why are you so focused on these superficial and material things? And then she says to me, and then I have to take a step back and realize that nothing's wrong with them. I'm the one who's changed. I'm the one who's now, in this completely different universe than I'm supposed to be in. So I found that really fascinating because these contexts, these moments, they have such huge meaning for all people involved. They are changed forever, not just by the person who's detained, but really in every single aspect of their lives. I remember being in Nairobi in 2007. I interviewed a 4-year-old, Hafsa Saleh Ali. She had been detained in a Kenyan prison for 30 days alongside her mother because they suspected that her father was involved with terrorism. And, Hafsa herself, as a 4-year-old, was interrogated separately to her mother. And even after release, and I think I interviewed her maybe 2 months after her release, even after her release, whenever she saw a Kenyan man in a uniform, even if he was a cleaner on the street, she would soil herself because she would associate a uniform with her detention period. So the trauma that Hafsa went through was encoded in her body. It was no longer simply that the trauma was relegated to a moment in the past. These moments have significance beyond that. Again, back in Pakistan, in Karachi, I was sitting at the dining table of a family who the husband had been put through an enforced disappearance for a number of years, and my mind kept on getting my eyes kept on getting distracted by the daughter. She was on the table and she was doing something that I found very strange. She was feeding a picture at the dinner table, and when I turned the picture around, I realized it was a picture of her father, and she was trying to retain a sense of meaning of what a relationship to her father might be by including him in this kind of dining experience. It's dinner time, it's breakfast time, it's lunchtime. My father's here, and I'm going to include him in this process of dining with him. So, the meaning that we take from all of this, it's so much bigger and grander than sometimes we take for granted. One of the Guantanamo Bay detainees here in the UK, Shakir Amir, he was held in Guantanamo for 13 years. You know, he'll talk to you himself. You know, he talks about this quite a lot. That the hardest part wasn't the fact that he was in Guantanamo for those 13 years. It was the fact that his youngest child, he has 4 children, his youngest child was born while he was there, while he was detained. And when he came back, like the whole notion of having a relationship with his own child was just completely non-existent. Like we take for granted what it means to hug somebody in a way that has full emotion, that you feel this palpable sense of just pure unending love for this person in front of you. And those 13 years, they took that away from him. That you know, that just that pure feeling of, okay, I'm hugging you with pure warmth and feeling that back. Those things you can't just get back. And that's why the trauma that we need to study has to be simply beyond the prisoner themselves. We have to look at how meaning is taken in all these different circumstances. And of course, one of the concerns that we have, and a lot of these studies came out of, in fact, the Holocaust, is this idea of intergenerational trauma, how those people who go through trauma, within the study of epigenetics, we see that markers are left on future generations, where the next generations, even 2 or 3 generations down the line, are more susceptible to hyperarousal. So when they're in that fight or flight situation, they're more susceptible to feeling like they need to run, or that they're scared of something. You know, whereas our normality is probably not the same as theirs, in terms of we're able to gauge fear better than they can. So that's important, because of course, you know, when we think about traumatized communities and how they then respond to their repression, those who have these histories and these trajectories of trauma are going to be more affected in the way that they then respond to the repression of the state. And so actions that they might take, you know, aren't necessarily just limited to that particular moment, but rather connected to a much longer and larger history. But of course, like, you know, we think a lot about prisoners, and of course, within the context of Palestine, Kashmir, these are nearly every single one of them is a political detention. But there is a whole category of individual, of those who were detained but never charged. So in different contexts around the world, the period of time for this can change. In the UK, you can be detained up to 28 days in pre-charge detention. Now, I was glad to see Osama speak about liberals, right? Because, you know, one of the things that liberals will tell us that, well, you know, the government wanted 90 days and we managed to get it down to 28. So that's a big win for all of us, right? You know, these things aren't wins, because the people who are suffering the violence of these moments, for them, their life is changed forever. When you get raided in the UK, there will be 60 police officers in 30 cars battering your door down. You know, many of them are Muslims, so their wives are not in hijab, their children are affected. There is a whole spectacle of trauma. Then they're taken away from anywhere between 7 to 28 days. And during that time, even if it's 7 days, do you think that person's still going to have a job at the other end? Do you think that their life is ever going to be the same? You know, I've heard so many times people who were arrested and never charged tell me that friends, family friends, that people that had known them for 30, 40 years would come and they would say, please remove our phone number from your phone book. You know, we know that there's nothing against you. We know that you were released without charge, but we don't want our own children to be affected by these things. We don't want our families to be impacted the way that you were. So we're sorry, but you know, this is the situation. And unfortunately, I've interviewed so many people who have been through circumstances that because as the others spoke about, the violence isn't just about the individual. It is about sending a message to the whole community that we have complete hegemony over the violence of your whole community. And therefore you need to change your behavior in order to make yourselves seem safe. Right? But of course there is violence in that, because we live with that trauma all the time. You know, even when we think about some of the jokes that we make now, the black humor that we've developed within the context of the war on terror, using terms like, oh, you're such an extremist, or you're such a, you know, don't say that out loud, or pretend like MI5s listening into your conversation. A lot of kind of, Muslims do this now within the context of the war on terror. They do it as a joke, but there is something that's real behind it, which is this palpable sense that we feel that we are under constant scrutiny. Terrorism experts like Mark Sageman, what do they tell us about this moment? They tell us that, his book Misunderstanding Terrorism, which is a very good book, I highly recommend, even though he's former CIA, but it's still a very good book. He describes that actually the reality of terrorism statistics is this, that currently for every one person who turns out to be somebody involved with political violence, sorry, I don't really like to use the term terrorist, I prefer political violence, there are 999,999 individuals who are arrested, detained, or suspected in some shape, form, or manner. That means they're getting it wrong 1 out of 999,999 out of every million times. We are suffering the consequence of that, and we have to acknowledge that that is the case, that that we have allowed, especially for liberals, to say when they say the argument that we need these laws, this is a price that we have to pay. The only people that are paying that price are largely Muslims and those who are considered to be seditious to the state. Because now we see, for example, in the UK, environmental activists having terrorism laws being used against them. So anyone who's considered even slightly seditious to the power and the hegemony of the state, especially towards neoliberalism, they are then brought into the rubric of being seditious and therefore within the rubric of terrorism. And so, ultimately, what are we talking about here? These laws, in the way that they are constructed, they have a chilling effect on our speech, on our lives, on our behaviors, and a chilling effect that ultimately brings in its own trauma, a trauma that we really cannot understand its full consequences in the now. We will only really start to see the consequences of this in the way that it exists, probably 10, 15, 20 years down the line. And, I don't even know what that will look like, but it's important that we arrest these practices in the war on terror as soon as possible in order to stop that long-term trauma from taking root. So I'm going to stop here now and hopefully open up more time for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Asim. I think, one of the things that we, especially within the liberal activist realm, as all of you have brought up, forget is the human impact of detainment and what that does to families. And you said, in your presentation, all people involved in detainment are changed forever throughout a variety of aspects, from their children to their families to the intergenerational traumas and the generations that will come after them. And we've seen this, and what colonialism has done to so many of our generations. And I think it's such a key thing to remember as we continue in the Q&A part of this webinar. We are talking about human beings in each of these three represented situations. So we have about 10 minutes for the Q&A, and so many of you have asked some pretty fantastic questions, so I thank you for that. I want to give, after the Q&A, the panelists just a few minutes just to wrap up and let you all know where you can follow them and follow their work. So we'll get to about 2 questions per panelist, and then we'll close out. So I apologize in advance if we are not able to get to your question, but you do have their contact on Twitter. Please be kind and connect with them there. So I want to start with you, Habeel. There were a lot of questions that came in regards to Kashmir and also the change from before and after the repealing of Article 370. So one of the questions that came in was, how do you think the nature and frequency of detention, torture, and arrest changed before and after the repealing of Article 370? Oh, you are on mute. I'm going to try to unmute you. Can you try to unmute yourself?
Yeah.
Yes, perfect.
So you want me to talk about what has changed post repealing of Article 370?
Yes, and if you could also, just for those who don't know what Article 370 is, if there are viewers that are unfamiliar with the situation in Kashmir, if you could just briefly say what Article 370 was.
So briefly, Article 370 gave quote unquote special status to the people of Jammu and Kashmir. So on 5th of last year, it was deoperationalized by the government of India, and it was deoperationalized unilaterally. So they did not consult the people of Jammu and Kashmir on that. But the larger picture here remains the same, that before repealing of the Article 370, it has always been the, I mean, military occupation here. So even after the repealing of the act, whatever little autonomy the Kashmir region, the Jammu and Kashmir region had, it was repealed. So basically, the attempt is to change the demographics, and if any possible solution to the Kashmir conflict arises in the future. So once you change the demographics of the region, so then you can alter, what you want, how the results are going to be. So that is their basic motive behind the repealment, behind the deoperationalizing of Article 370. And in cases of changes, the change can be from what I told you, change in the demographics, that outsiders who could not buy land in Jammu and Kashmir previously, we can have, it's a project for settler colonialism. We can say that just like in Palestine, we had settlers who took over it, and then we are seeing how Osama elaborated everything about Palestine. So this repealing of the act is seen as a beginning of the same settler colonialism in Kashmir. But mind it, even before Article 370, if the military apparatus of Indian state had to take over any land, had to do anything, they would always do it under the garb of different acts. So in that sense, not much has changed. It has the repressive state has always been doing one tactic or the other. But now this has been seen as the last nail in the coffin. So whatever little autonomy the region was enjoying, it has been stripped of that very unilaterally, and it has been followed by mass arrests. Internet still, when I'm talking to you, we are still on 2G. So internet what was restored after months. There have been so many atrocities that, yeah, it's very difficult to talk about all that at length here. But yeah, briefly, I think I summed it.
Yes, thank you so very much, Habeel. Another question that came through in regards to Article 370 and 35A, and especially in regards to the International Criminal Court, is two-part question. One, is there a case for India to take to the ICC as Burma had done in the past? And then additionally, with the reference to the revocation of Article 370 and 35A, the Indian Constitution showed it as temporary provisions with respect to the state of Jammu and Kashmir. Did that mean they could revoke it at any time when desired, or was it subject to referendum?
See, I would say when we use these technicalities of temporary provisions, we are resorting to legal sophistry and nothing more than that. So the case was pending in the Supreme Court of India, and when the government decided to bring in an ordinance, it undermined its own Supreme Court. So on that context, I mean, but this has been happening here all along, that how the role of the judiciary, we can talk about that maybe some other time, how the judiciary has behaved like an extended arm of the executive. So that's why we have come to this position now, wherein the people of Jammu and Kashmir have little hope in the last refuge of the institution of justice, that is the courts. That's regarding Article 370. And now what can we do, the people of Jammu and Kashmir, regarding can we take our cases to the international forums? We have of late, there has been there have been two UN reports on the atrocities in Jammu and Kashmir in 2018, 2019. So there has been an international pressure has been building up. but again, lot more needs to be done, and approaching international criminal courts. Some of we have very the procedural limits, and then we know the executive machinery of imposing the international laws is not so great. So I think the better choice would be to highlight it more at an international level, to
Mhm.
build international pressure, international public opinion, to show to the world what India is doing in Jammu and Kashmir, and that will be more effective than taking to the courts where we will face procedural difficulties. It will be time consuming. So in my humble opinion, this collaborative effort we are witnessing here, this can be one beginning where we can bring solidarities, where we can bring groups across the cutting across nations, and solidarity networks can be made. So I think these efforts can be made, which can really highlight what we are witnessing in Jammu and Kashmir, and how the international community can pressurize India to have some confidence building measures here. Like this is the we have seven security. We have seven security. One civilian has seven security personnel. So this is like they should at least begin with demilitarizing and revoking some of these draconian laws, and then maybe sit on the dialogue table with Pakistan and people of Jammu and Kashmir and settle this once for all.
Thank you so much, Habeel. Osama, two questions for you. There have been a few that have come in, so I'm going to try to pack them into two questions. In terms of Palestine, the one of the questions that came in was remedies through courts of laws. Through courts of laws in the ICC and other places like the UN almost seem impossible at this point. Do you think political movements and mass resistance have helped or are helping to some extent so far?
Yes, I think so. I think they've really, at least in the sense of the international stage or the sphere of publicity, I think mass-based movements, resistance in terms of even something as small as advancing the language. We've seen a huge shift in the kind of language used to describe the Israeli occupation, used to describe the affairs in Palestine, even within the United States. And I think with that being said, I think it's also not sort of a legitimization of these structures if people deem it necessary to pursue kind of relief through the official legal mechanisms, right? Like going to like Palestinians who have gone to the Israeli prison services or gone to the Israeli Supreme Court, just as a contrast to mass-based structures and resistance, and requested through legal means, reducing the sentence, or at least charging the Palestinian who they've been detaining for who knows how long. I think those approaches actually serve to sort of expose even more so the Israeli insistence on violating international law and human rights. And one last point, I think, on this idea of, I don't know if the question was referring to mass-based movements just in Palestine. I was kind of thinking of it as it refers to the global solidarity movement. Even within the US, as I said before, there was a point at which no one could have said, like 10 years ago, or more than 10 years ago, that Israel is an apartheid state. The kind of shutdown, the kind of censorship, which still goes on, but was so severe that it was unthinkable. And now it's not unthinkable to be able to, as a student organizer, get on campus and push for, a BDS resolution, or to call Israel an apartheid state. So I think, at least in terms of language, yes. In terms of actually alleviating the material conditions in Palestine, no. Final point is that when the International Criminal Court in 2004, I believe, released their advisory opinion saying that the apartheid wall in Palestine was, they deemed it illegal. I mean, it's still there, right? So it's a difficult conversation in terms of how to balance these approaches.
Thank you so much, Osama. And then another question. These are kind of, this is kind of three questions in one, so I apologize if it's,
okay.
I'm trying to pack it in. It has to do around COVID and also curfew for Palestinians. So how do Palestinians survive during indefinite curfew? How are they impacted? And what do you see as the impact of coping, or can they cope with COVID-19? And how are prisoners, what is the response to prisons and COVID in Palestine?
Okay, so I think I'll take the approach of answering the curfew question and then kind of getting into COVID-19. I think, so as I also read the question as it popped up, it was saying, how do Palestinians manage to basically exist with these curfews basically in place, indefinite all the time? I think it's important to mention the circumstances differ in Palestine depending on which area you're in. And even depending on which area you're in, there's areas A, B, and C set up by the Oslo Accords through 1993 to 1995 through the process of actually institutionalizing Oslo. Area A being under, full supposed Palestinian Authority control, which is kind of the neo-colonial body set up in conjunction with the Palestinian elites and the Israeli occupation, have full control of Area A, supposedly. Area B was envisioned to be joint Israeli-Palestinian control, and Area C, which actually takes up the majority of the West Bank, is under complete hegemony of the occupation. So in areas A, I mean, sometimes you don't have a curfew depending on where you are in Area A. I'm from a village that is actually in Area A, but despite being in Area A, quite often we will have, when I'm visiting my family overseas, you will have random night raids that happen, and you can see them clearly, even though we are supposed to be in the great Bantustan that is Area A. In Area B, similarly, you're supposed to have Palestinian Authority civil control, yet Israel can invade whenever they want. And then in Area C, you have curfews and also the threat of many homes and villages being demolished. And in all of these areas, you can have random curfews imposed at all times, regardless of which area you're in, regardless of supposed Palestinian Authority area of control. When these curfews are instituted, I mean, Palestinians, through movement building, through their networks, through grouping together, they attempt to maneuver around Israeli restrictions on Palestinian movement. And COVID-19, correct. So one thing about, generally speaking, the Zionist, within the prisons, and also within, I mean, this is again, like the connection between the prisons and the Palestinian street. It is a policy that is part and parcel to the Zionist occupation to push for medical negligence within Palestine. In that the Israeli occupation has essentially deteriorated every precondition for public health in Palestine. But if we focus on the case of the prisoners, there was an example of Noor al-Barghouthi, who was a 23-year-old Palestinian imprisoned for his resistance against a Zionist settler occupation. About last week, he died after losing consciousness in an Israeli jail. According to the Palestinian Prisoner Society and the movement, the prison guard neglected to act quickly, waited more than half an hour before providing medical treatment, and he fell as a martyr. And there's many different examples of this. So with COVID-19, especially, we've had Palestinian prisoners been infected by COVID-19, coronavirus, introduced by an Israeli interrogation officer. And while prisoners are supposed to be in quarantine because of this outbreak within the prisons, the Israeli prison officers continue to conduct daily searches of their cells without wearing PPE, proper protective equipment. So there's this complete disregard of prisoner safety and health. And medical negligence is a reoccurring policy that Israeli prison services have routinely used. And I believe 3 Palestinians have fell martyr already due to COVID-19 within the prisons. I hope that answered every facet of the question.
Thank you so much, Osama. Asim, 2 more questions for you, and then we're going to wrap up the webinar. And thank you everybody for asking your questions. I know we haven't been able to get to all of them. Asim, one of the questions, this question came through on Zoom. How can we influence the international community to realize that families and friends of prisoners are victims as well? The questioner gives an example of a sister of a physically and mentally tortured detainee for 120 days, stating over and over through those 120 days that she feels like she is the one who is being imprisoned and tortured, and the effects are unbelievably real.
Sure. Thank you for the question. Yeah, I think this is the one of the hardest questions to answer, because we haven't reached a situation where prisoners themselves are seen as human beings yet. And so, you know, trying to extend that understanding of care and concern beyond them, you know, that seems like a dream from another reality, maybe, because I mean, like I was saying in my presentation, the biggest problem that we have really is the extent to which those who are supposed to be our allies are constantly telling us that this is a price that we all have to pay. And I guess one of the things that I've been trying to do in my work is trying to, especially maybe in some of my more philosophical work, trying to think about what complicity means in these structures of extreme violence that we're all subject to. So, you know, ultimately, you know, those of us who are at most risk, at the highest end of being subject to that violence, we are actually the least complicit. You know, the detainee themselves, the families of the detainee, in the system and the structure, we have to understand that they have zero agency. All they want is their life back, or some meaning of a life that is well lived and well fulfilled, right? And so there is no judgment upon them for trying to use the system. And, you know, as Habeel mentioned himself already, that the law itself is part of the violence of the system. And so we, you know, they are the least complicit. But as we move away from the individual, their family that's impacted, then it's the community. The community suffers the violence as well. It sees the violence, it suffers the violence, it becomes scared. There's a less of a complicity there, okay? By the time we get to the liberal media, the liberal NGOs, the amnesties that Osama mentioned, they should be the ones taking the most risks at holding the structures of violence to account. And, you know, this is something that I've been very, very forceful on in my work, that, you know, those who suffer at the hardest end of the violence are definitely the least complicit in the system. Their use of the system does not indicate that they think that the system is okay. As liberals tell us, liberals want to give us the idea that building in human rights safeguards into racist structures somehow is okay. It's not okay. The structure is still racist. Providing adequate blankets and pillows does not mean that our oppression is okay. It's like I was stopped recently coming back into the UK. I mean, I'm a citizen of the country, but we have a law here under the Terrorism Act that allows you to be detained. You have to answer their questions by law, and if you don't, they can charge you with a terrorism offense for refusing to do so. Okay, and this is a suspicionless stop, so it's just a profiling stop. So at one point, halfway through, they asked me, you know, you're a practicing Muslim. Would you like to pray? And I refused, because I'm not going to let anybody make them feel like their racist profiling is somehow, you know, that I'm going to make them feel better about it. I just want to be done with this. Even if I pray late, I'd rather that than for you to feel better about yourself, about what you're putting me through. Okay. And I think this is one of the key things here, that, you know, in our activism, in the work that we're doing, in our campaigning, we don't shoot for small goals. Okay. That's extremely important, that, you know, the idea that we just give up our rights because it's politically the right thing to do. We need to stop with all of that. You know, that's where we are well past the point of reasoning our way out of this. Okay. And so we need to be holding, especially those who claim to fight in our name, those organizations, that the liberal organizations that claim to be, you know, fighting for Palestinian rights, for Kashmiri rights, against Islamophobia. We need to be saying to them that actually you guys need to be taking more risks in what you're doing, because you are at the least violent end of the spectrum, and therefore the risk taking should be highest at your end. So I hope that goes some way to answer the question, even if it's more philosophical.
I think that was an excellent answer, and it is so true. This is something that we all need to keep in mind, that we have to keep the bigger picture in mind. It is not about the small wins. The second question that I want to ask you actually came in via email, and each of the contexts that you are referring to, or that you refer to, rely on the logic of terrorism to incarcerate people. How do you attempt to challenge that, or how are you challenging that? And how can we build, or still build, meaningful solidarity amongst a broader group of people and institutions, given what the bogey of terrorism can do?
Sure, thank you. That's a really, really great question. So here's an interesting fact about the UK. And I mean, actually, I'm more familiar with the US than I am the UK, but, you know, both contexts are similar in many respects. You do not get, if you commit an act of political violence in the UK, you don't get charged for terrorism offenses. Okay, so if you commit an actual act of violence, you get charged under the criminal justice system, under the Foreign Explosives Act, if there's an element of a bomb or a fire, or under the Offences Against Persons Act, but you won't get charged or convicted under terrorism laws. Terrorism laws kick in when there's no violence, okay? Because it's part of a structure of racism and pathologizing that we have. And that is where the actual violence takes place, right? And so we have to challenge exactly what terrorism is and what terrorism convictions are, because nearly always they are for things that have nothing to do with actual violence. We you know, we all want safe societies. We all want societies that are free of violence. But when people are getting arrested for reading the wrong book, then that is a problem. I mean, I'll give you an example of a case of a young woman named Roxana Begum. Her brothers were convicted of terrorism offenses. They pled guilty. Even their guilty plea was somewhat suspicious, because they were willing to fight it. And on the morning of the trial, the prosecution came to them and said, you know, we believe that there is evidence that your mother and your sisters were somehow blocking our investigation, and therefore we're thinking about prosecuting them too as well. And, you know, like most people in our cultures, the next thing you do is you sign whatever document it is that they want you to sign, right? So there were very, very suspicious aspects to them pleading guilty before the trial even began, even though they had prepped for trial. But anyway, Roxana herself, she had started reading some of the material that was as part of the defense strategy, and she had this on a USB stick. Now, if you read certain types of magazines, let's just say that, you know, kind of more on the militant end, for example, like the Anarchist Cookbook or whatever, then that technically is a strict liability offense. There is no longer any presumption of innocence. By having that material in your possession, you have committed the offense. It is now upon you to prove that you had a reasonable excuse for having it. So in the end, her lawyer tells her to plead guilty. He says, look, no jury is going to see you in a good light, because your brothers pled guilty as well. They're probably going to come down quite hard on you. It's better that you plead guilty. In her sentencing by the judge says to her, these are pretty much his words. Okay, you can find the case online. He says, you're a good person. You had a great career ahead of you. You're on a good track in life. I do not believe that you had any involvement or any intention to be involved with terrorism, but because you pled guilty, I have to sentence you. And because I'm a bit unsure about your personal views that you might have on the inside, I'm going to sentence you to a year in prison so that you can go through mandatory de-radicalization. He's already recognized that there's no issue here with her, that there's nothing about her life that indicates that she has any desire to be involved in terrorism whatsoever and any acts of political violence. But yet he still gives her a year in prison. And then while she's in prison, she has to go through all these assessments, and they ask her questions like, what do you think of these, kind of far right groups? Well, she says, if you're going to ban certain Muslim groups, then you should ban these groups as well. And they would like label her down as having an us versus them mentality. So all of this is a pathologizing. The way that these systems and structures are built, especially when it comes to people of color, is that they take cultural markers about who we are and and what our lives are like, and then they produce these laws that are geared towards producing the results that we see. So when people talk about there are this many people convicted of terrorism in the UK, that statistic is absolute nonsense, because the number of people who are actually involved in violence is negligible in that group. My own colleague, Mohammed Rabbani, we were in, sorry, I'll try and finish this up very quickly, but we were in the Middle East together, interviewing a man who had, for 13 years, been tortured and abused by the FBI. And we were implicating a very high profile FBI agent, his name's Ali Soufan, in this case. And all of this was very, very secret at the time we were doing the investigation. So when I had to go off to another country to do some more work, but he came back to the UK. When he came back to the UK under the same legislation I told you about before, he stopped. They asked for the passwords to his devices, and he had some of the client confidential information on his devices. He says, I can't give it to you. I can't give you my device because I have client confidential information, and if I do, then I would be in breach of that. They said, look, we're gonna charge you with an offense, with a terrorism offense, if you don't give us your devices. He said, I can't. It's my ethical duty to maintain the integrity of my client's information. So they charged him, and he was convicted as a terrorist for refusing to hand over his passwords. And this is in the UK, of course. We're not talking about kind of some kind of this so-called despotic regime, but this is the thing about the globalization of the war on terror. And this is why I come back to Angela Davis's statement, that all of this militarization connects these practices and these policies together. We cannot see them as distinct from one another. Yes, of course, they look slightly different in what they pathologize, maybe. Like, for example, now we have terrorism laws being used to pathologize so-called black gangs over the types of music they listen to. That's used in a matrix of counterterrorism that they have specifically for black gangs. So everyone gets pathologized in different ways, but the architecture is ultimately the same.
Thank you so much, Asim. I want to take a moment, and I mean, we could keep on this discussion going for a very long time. And I suspect that we will probably have another webinar in the very near future with our panelists again, because there is so much still to unpack. So with that, I just want to, Habeel, Osama, and Asim, if you can just give a brief where people can find you and how they can follow your work, that would be great. Habeel, I'll start with you.
Well, as I said, as you also mentioned, that we are on Twitter, so people can follow there, and then we can exchange maybe email IDs with individuals who want to reach to us. And about the work, I would urge here people to please talk about Release Kashmiri Prisoners campaign. It's on their website also. Individuals as well as organizations can both do their bit. They can learn more about this campaign. And yes, I feel this is a great beginning here, and we should have more such webinars and collaborative efforts in the future also, even when COVID is gone.
Thank you so much, Habeel. Osama, turning it over to you.
Yes, first of all, I'd like to say Thank you, Habeel, and thank you, Asim. I've learned so much. I have a lot of reading to do, and feel very enlightened by the session we've had. I kind of want to just mention really briefly when you were speaking, Asim, about the situation in the UK and the line that you said that the terrorism charges come into play when there is no violence. There was a very historic case here, and I'm sure you may be familiar with it, but the Holy Land Foundation. It's a very significant case in the history of surveillance and imprisonment of Palestinian Muslims in the era of the War on Terror. For the sake of time, I can't get into it. Palestinian Youth Movement, pymusa.com. So pymusa.com, you can read the statements and information and analysis that the Palestinian Youth Movement sets up. There is a statement released on the Holy Land Foundation that kind of speaks to it. It was without a doubt probably, it just had a huge chilling effect on Muslim and the Arab communities in the US and on Muslim and Palestinian organizing in particular. I'd also like to highlight Samidun.net. Samidun.net is the Palestinian, it's a solidarity network for Palestinian prisoners advancing their struggle, advancing their cause. Samidun.net, there's a lot of campaigns that they conduct, and their analysis is one that I also appreciate. Yeah.
Sorry,
Thank you,
Asim. Yes, sorry, Osama. Thank you so much. I was unmuting myself. Asim, please.
Yeah, thank you, Osama. I really appreciate you mentioned the Holy Land Foundation case. I think there are so many Palestinian cases actually that we need to be thinking about, especially in their nexus to the war on terror. So yeah, you can follow my organization's work, Cage. It's www.cage.ngo. Well, all over Instagram, Twitter. I have an account on Instagram called The Booksmist, which is really looking at kind of social justice readings over kind of a range of literature that you might be interested into. So yeah, inshallah, we can kind of stay connected with one another across the range of these issues we've been discussing today. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Asim, Osama, and Habeel. Thank you to everybody who has joined us for this webinar on Zoom and on YouTube. I apologize again if we didn't get to your questions, but we will be sending out follow-up information. If you are on Zoom, you will see that I've just put in the mailing list. So if you are not on the mailing list, please sign up there, because that is where we send out the next coming webinars in the series and further information. So sign up there. Please take care of yourselves. To all of our Muslim brothers and sisters and siblings, Ramadan Mubarak to all of you, and stay tuned for more in this webinar series. Thank you again to everyone, and to Habeel, Asim, and Osama.